Good afternoon. My name is David Guimaraens. I'm the port maker for the Fladgate Partnership, Taylor Fladgate Ports, and it is with great pleasure that today we have with us Karen Macneil. Karen is the author of the famous book Bible, and she's also one of the most respected authorities on wine in North America. Today, we're going to be looking at the magnificent world of tawny ports. Tawny ports, within the world of port, are very much those ports that we age in our cellars for many years, and they are bottled when we feel they're ready for drinking. It's a specific segment of port, and a very delicious one, and one that certainly North America has grown to fall in love with. So, Karen, lovely for you to join us. And I also know that we share the passion for this region where port is made, the Golden Valley. And thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, David. It's wonderful to be here. I have 4 exciting bottles of the Taylor Fladgate Tawny Port in front of me, and I'm very excited to taste them with you.
Well, it's going to be an interesting trip through these different tawny ports, and you just pointed out exactly these 4 ports we'll be tasting. And when we look about tawny ports, and the word tawny is a very word to describe the style, because a young port is a ruby, it's a red port. As it ages in wood, in contact with oxygen in these oak barrels, we're talking about old seasoned oak barrels, they become tawny in color. And we'll be tasting, the first tawny port will be a 10-year-old tawny, and we will progress in age to the 20. We'll have a quick look at the 30-year-old, or not so quick, because there's some really interesting points I want to share with you in our Taylor Fladgate 30-year-old. And the oldest tawny port we'll be tasting here today is the 40-year-old. But exactly within this world of the tawny ports, there isn't a limit of age. And one of the great experiences I had in my career was having discovered this incredible old tawny port from 1857, which we launched in 2010 as the Scion, and that was the most incredible tawny port I've ever drunk and been lucky to be part of.
Why then, David, if I can ask, because you talked about color, I'm going to lift up my glass of 10 and my glass of 40. I don't know if all of our guests and viewers can see the difference in them. But I'm wondering, I've never seen a port older than a 40-year-old tawny. Why do the port houses not make 50 and 60-year-old? Is it just not possible because there simply aren't those kinds of stocks readily available?
Well, in fact, those stocks are available, and particularly since we launched the Scion, many other port houses have come out and launched very old tawny ports. And if we look at the history of tawny port within the port houses, it has evolved considerably over our history. And if I look maybe a couple of generations ago, we did put an age on the bottle of a tawny port. So you wouldn't see a 20-year-old tawny port. You would see a tawny port, for example, with a name on it. Delaforce had its Eminence Choice, or the Fonseca 30-year-old was Choco. But it was in the 60s, and particularly in the 70s, when the trade understood that the consumer wanted to have some orientation as to the age of these ports. And that's when the port trade started taking these house blends and giving them a date. So a 10-year-old tawny is a tawny port which has an average age of 10 years. A 40-year-old tawny port is a port that has an average age of 40 years. And it's actually quite interesting because recently, with the release of these very old tawny ports, where if you bottle a tawny port older than 40 years of age, you cannot put a date on it. There, you just put a very old tawny port, and that is the registration that we are permitted to use. But in fact, there has been discussion recently is that should we have launch a 50-year-old tawny port? So the reality is that the port trade has been very successful, particularly in the last 10 years, of releasing these special release very old tawny ports. But because these are limited releases, the way we bring them to market, the way we tell the story, we don't feel it is necessary to put an age indication on the label. And that has happened, and it has happened increasingly. And your question as to, do these stocks exist? They do, very much so, across not only amongst the porthouses, but also in the Dodder Valley, where by tradition there are many families who cultivate the vineyards and make port to then sell on to the port shippers. They, generation after generation, have kept stocks of port to age, and there are these old ports available in the trade. And you are seeing more and more of these coming to market.
So with the bottles that we all know, though, with 10-year-old, 20-year-old, 30-year-old, and 40-year-old, how mathematically specific do you get? When you say that a 20-year-old is an average age, is it exactly mathematically that case, or is it more that aesthetically, to a professional's taste like your own, you estimate that it's about, the average is about 20 years old here?
Well, okay, let me probably even bring that into context to explain the reason why we blend to create an average age. And that is where I will talk very briefly about vintage port. Vintage port is the port that many of the port houses by tradition capture the extraordinary quality of the year. They have a date on it. It then ages in the bottle. The blended tawny, like a 20-year-old, the reason why we blend different years is in the tawny ports, we are blending to a consistency of a house style. And by the art of the blender, who accompanies these ports as they age for many years and even across generations, we are cross-blending ports from different years so that we eliminate the character of one year to make a consistent blend. And that is one of the beauties of, and one of the attractions of the consumer going to buy a Taylor Fladgate 20-year-old, which is, if he likes it, it will always be the same, it will be consistent. So the way we work it in our house is that our records that we have, every port has got an age. Obviously, if it's 1 year, it's the age of that year. Every time you add two different components of different ages, in whatever proportion you add it, we mathematically calculate the new age, the new average age. And that is done throughout its lifetime. So yes, when we are bottling our 20-year-old, it will have at least, and I say at least, 20 years of age, because then we have one further step to get through, which is we have to submit every blend that we sell to a professional tasting panel, which is the Port Wine Institute, and they will certify that every blend that we want to bottle and we say is a 20-year-old, it has the characteristics of a port which has 20 years. So let's say that even if we have a port which is 20 years old, but we haven't aged it to get that complexity, just because it's 20-year-old, it doesn't automatically be entitled to it. So all port that is bottled is actually certified by a professional body to ensure the minimum quality. The maximum quality, that's up to us. And for us at Taylor Fladgate, that's what we've been doing for generations, and we obviously always want to achieve the maximum quality. But yes, when you're talking about a 20-year-old, the average age is an average age which is calculated that way.
So you not only know how to make wine, but you're good at math. This is very reassuring, David. Very reassuring.
Well, it's not that difficult as some to do just as well, because the making the wine is the important part. One note which I didn't mention earlier in the tawny ports, and this wonderful world of tawny ports, that the ports that we age in our cellars, is that there are tawny ports from a single year, a single harvest. And at Taylor Fladgate, we have released now for the last 6 years a 50-year-old single harvest tawny port, and that one has a date on it. Those are also known as colheitas. A colheita, in fact, very interesting, the word colheita is the Portuguese word for the harvest. And the tawny ports with the name colheita will be from one specific year. And that's where we can opt as a shipper or as a farmer to hold that port on its own and take care of it as it ages without doing any blending across different years, to be just a tawny port from that single year. And certainly the single harvest, the 50-year-old single harvest that we've been releasing from Taylor Fladgate has been an extraordinary success in recent years.
My goodness.
And so having said that, there are some producers that release a 60-year-old or 58-year-old. There is no age limit on the single harvest tawny ports, as long as you have the record of that port in your cellars from the day that you made it. So when we released the Scion, although we knew it was from 1857, we did not have the record, so we were not able to put that on the label. But the booklet that we wrote, or the book that we wrote that accompanied the Scion, has that written down and says that. We did release 3 or 4 years ago a single harvest from 1863, which is just unbelievable. So there are some very old single harvest tawny ports out there, and which you can enjoy.
It's absolutely magnificent, the respect for history and tradition among the port shippers. Really quite incredible.
It is very much a work of looking to the next generation. I would say in general in the wine business, it is for all of us, because when we plant a vineyard today, realistically, it's not going to be before 10 or 20 years that vineyard actually grows up and becomes really consistent. And when you're making wines, and the top quality wines, be it port, be it your normal wine, you want them to be able to age, and your reputation, not only your own is at stake, but for the next generation. Now, yes, port, and port is a fortified wine, and this extraordinary ability for it to age and how it develops in complexity over time, then the legacy becomes even more part of what we are as a family company, as we are as a business. And let's face it, the many dedicated families of older farmers who they themselves, maybe not selling it as a finished wine, have had their properties from generation to generation supplying us as port shippers. I think we have frozen momentarily, but whilst we wait for Karen to come back. You're back, Karen?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes. Okay. We had a temporary freeze. And it's not from the weather outside, I can assure you. Yeah, so Karen, I was talking about exactly the legacy of port and how port as a fortified wine has got this even greater capacity to age. So, when we're talking about, say, a 30-year-old, in fact, I think the 30-year-old for me is very dear to me because this year marks 30 years since I came back home to work at the family company. And so finally, the port that I made 30 years ago is now actually in this 30-year-old port. But I know that the ports I'm making today will be for the next generation. But, that's the joy of this business.
Quite extraordinary. So shall we begin with the 10-year-old and give it a taste?
Yes. Well, so when you're choosing to drink a tawny port and what characters they have, what you have to appreciate is that as a tawny port ages in wood, we lose 2% of evaporation per year, and as you evaporate, you concentrate your sugars and your acidity. And a 10-year-old port will have, of the aged tawnies, the one which still has the greatest amount of fruit character. So any tawny port, this dried fruit, this nuttiness, will always be its characterizing flavor. And as that develops over time, that becomes even more intense. But the 10-year-old being still youthful, you get still a lot of fresh fruit in there, a bit of figs, you'll get some berry, and so this is where you get a lot of that richness. On the palate, you've already got the smoothness, so if you were to compare this in a tasting with, for example, a young reserve like a late bottle vintage, where you'd have the fruit, you'd have tannin. In the 10-year-old, your tannins have softened out, but they're still there, and that tannin is also going to balance your sweetness. But the richness that you get, that nuttiness, is going to be the character which is in common with every tawny port.
David, when you're evaluating tawny ports, is there a certain, I don't know exactly how to say this, but are you looking for the sweetness itself to come across in a certain kind of way? Because I noticed that in really beautiful tawnies, yes, they are sweet, but they're not saccharine. They're not like candy.
Thank you, Karen, for bringing up probably one of the most important points of the beauties of tawny port, and which is tawny port is naturally sweet, and that sweetness is the natural sugar which came from the grape from the young port. As it ages, it becomes more concentrated, so it gets more sweet. But it is so important that any sweet fortified wine, any port is sweet, it starts sweet, but it finishes dry. And because you don't want it to be a sticky. If anybody calls any of my ports a sticky, then I don't think I've done a very good job blending. And this is where the art of the blender comes in, because it's the art of the blender and the skills behind the way you age your port. And so if you have sweetness of fruit in a 10-year-old, that tannin that's there will help dry it. The spirit, the alcohol level in port is also very important, because although the Douro Valley naturally does not have a lot of high natural acidity, this is where port as a fortified wine the spirit you use to fortify also balances your sweetness. And so, sometimes you can say, well, would you want to make port with a lower grade of alcohol, for example, at 18%? And I'd say no, because you'll lose that balance, and then your stickiness will come out. And so that's a key point. So when we taste the 20-year-old, and probably taking this note, Karen, to move across to the 20-year-old, is that the 20-year-old has got twice the age of the 10-year-old. And naturally, your fruit has diminished considerably. And you can see in the color, well, this is one of the not so easy things to do in the Instagram interviews, but it's become tawnier in color. So you've got more of a brick brown rim. You've got less color intensity because you've lost your reds, and your nuttiness is duplicated. That nuttiness is double in character in relation to the 10-year-old. But at the same time, on the palate, when you taste it, you still have some fresh fruit to carry. Now that fruit is much more subtle than in the 10, but it is there. And this is a point where the work of the blender is very important in determining, giving the bitter fruit to balance the sweetness, which Karen, you were saying is so important. Because when I'm putting the 20-year-old blend, if I take, for example, 80% of a 22-year-old port, and if I then add 20% of an 8-year-old port, and I haven't done my maths here, so somebody will do some there, but you can end up with a port which is an average age of 20 years, but that fruitiness that you got from that small proportion of a younger component will balance your sweetness. On the other hand, if I was to do a blend which I took 50% of a 22-year-old port and 50% of an 18-year-old port, I'd have the same 20-year-old, but you probably wouldn't have so much of that youthfulness to give it that freshness. And so I personally consider the 20-year-old as the perfect tawny port for regular drinking, where you combine complexity of age, freshness of youth, and value for money. So this is the sort of port that you'd be drinking every day at the end of work. Have a glass at the end of the day. And whereas if you're drinking a 10-year-old, it is not as expensive for 10. It is delicious, but you still have a lot of fruit. Once you go past the 20-year-old, you get more complexity, but you have less fruit, and they're much more expensive. And that's why the US has completely gone crazy for the Taylor Fladgate 20-year-old. It is the most popular port in restaurants because it's that. It's got everything in a great balance. And the two of us are enjoying it because we're tasting it. Everybody else is going to have to run out and get a bottle or go to a restaurant and have a glass to get that enjoyment.
I guess for me, I've always felt that 20-year-old was just that beautiful combination of a port being both young and old simultaneously. And so I love that too. And I actually love the fact that you cannot, maybe this is just from being a writer. Writers tend to like things that they cannot describe because it's frustrating to them. And so by the time you get to 20 years old, it's harder to describe what's going on in the wine. It's coalesced a little bit more. And the sweetness seems a little more refined in a way. The fruit is subtler. Everything about it is just a bit more integrated, um, which is very attractive, given the fact that that 20-year-old port does not cost very much. Sorry to say for you. Good for
I
us,
think
though.
we're crazy. We almost give it away, but I'll always have that challenge with my team on the road, finding the right price. But you know, Karen, the other thing is that um, all of us, we're all consumers, whether we're winemakers, whether we're wine critics, whether we're a normal consumer not involved with the industry. And when you get these tawny pours, and particularly these are where we're tasting today, the blended tawnies, this is where we as professionals are doing our job to make something consistently good for an occasion where wine is not necessarily the focus. We all have moments where we have a group of wine people where we want to open a bottle of wine, we want to see what was this year like, or how does this producer compare with the other. But we also have other moments where maybe we're with the family and we don't want to talk about wine, but we enjoy drinking wine. And this is where port, the aged tawny ports are wonderful, because you can serve your 20-year-old with your dessert at the end of the meal, and you can be talking about your grandchildren, or you can be talking about the football, and you don't care about the wine as long as it's good and it's good to taste. And there are many occasions for that. And this is not always easy, because I know that as wine journalists, what are you going to write about? 20-year-old Tail Fadgate, wow, it's great. It's as great as it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. You know, I think that's why occasions like today is a good occasion to talk about these. But the fact is, there are many consumers out there who've discovered the qualities and trust us in our work. And that, for me, as a winemaker, as a blender, is the greatest satisfaction that I can have, is that the consumer trusts what we do.
Mhm. David, let me ask you about an idea that I haven't thought very much about, I don't think, in the past, but tasting this 20-year-old, and it may be in the 30 as well, and that is a slight sense of what I would call noble bitterness. I love the flavor of like the paper on nuts or roasted nuts, where yes, it's sweet, but it's also a little bit bitter in a good way. Um,
Well,
and is that in your thinking at all when I know you're thinking about acidity, you're thinking about tannin, you're thinking about sugar, but are you also ever thinking about this concept of good bitters?
Karen, we didn't actually plan any of these questions, but you're leading on to the 30-year-old in perfection with this question, because um, when we jump from the 20 to the 30, we're adding another 10 more years. And to me, that character that you're describing really comes through the 30. And it comes through for, to me, two reasons. One of them is, to me, in the 30, besides the nutty character that you have, besides the concentration, to me, there are some aromas and some flavors of our port cellars. Um, the wood that we use is old seasoned wood, and which has its own character, and that starts coming through. So um, we went from the 10-year-old, which was nutty, but it was still fruity. We went to the 20, which was the perfect balance of everything in harmony. Now, when we jump to the 30, we go to that level that you pour yourself a large glass, you go and sit in the corner, like little Jack Horner, and you ignore everybody around it, and you just put your nose in and you keep going into the nose to discover more and more things. And then on the palate, I think you get some of those almost a bit earthy notes as well. So that's almost more of a rustic character, which is almost what you say, that bit of bitterness. But there's one secret that comes here. Well, it's not a secret, it's a characteristic that I like to share with you, is that for the Taylor 30-year-old, it has always been the tradition to have a lower sugar level than is usual for this level of age. And we do that because some of the ports that we age from the outset are made to a lower sweetness. And that makes the Taylor 30 this incredible combination of complexity of age, richness and concentration, the acidity that you get from the evaporation as you age, but this dryness gives this most incredible finish which goes on and on. And this is where I'm going to share with you what to me is one of the best combinations to drink of the Taylor Fladgate 30-year-old. You put the bottle in the fridge and let it go cold, but cold, fridge cold. And you serve it with, as an appetizer, anything with fresh flour, which I'm not sure you can always have, but quite a rich, almost a meaty starter. And you can have this as a starter. Very often we drink the tawny ports at the end of the meal with your dessert. We'll talk a bit more around in a moment. But you can play around with the tawny, the 30-year-old tawny, like that. And I mentioned the temperature. Please, 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 whenever you serve a tawny port, chill it down. Bring the temperature down. Because when you chill a tawny port, you subdue the alcohol, but the concentration from the nuttiness really jumps out. And you cannot do it with a fruity port. It's like you can't chill a red wine too much because you'll lose the fruit. But a tawny port, do chill it. And it's warm at the moment, and there is nothing more delicious than a chilled tawny port on a warm summer evening. I always say to lubricate the conversation.
So when you're saying chill, you mean refrigerator chill?
Well, if it's the summer, as soon as you pull it out, it'll start warming up. So have no problems with that. Put it in the ice bucket when you go to the table, and that I do at home. And think in the summer, you've got your ice bucket from your white wine. You've got your 20-year-old. I put it in the ice bucket, and it doesn't last long.
No. I put these in my cellar overnight,
Yes.
so that they would be, around 58 degrees. But I'm going to try next time putting them in the fridge as well. Because I agree, just leaving it out on the counter, room temperature. I'm in Napa Valley. Room temperature is a little too warm. It needs to be colder than that.
Yes, Karen, and that's also an interesting point. Very often people associate port with being drunk in the winter, and that's because normally the room temperature is lower. But if people go and take a tawny port and chill it in the summer, then you won't think it's a winter drink. If you serve a warm tawny port in the summer, you won't enjoy that either. So temperature is key. It really is key.
Yeah. David, I want to ask you too about this concept of acidity, because this 30-year-old is my favorite. I think because also it's so indescribable. It has that beautiful noble bitterness, and you had mentioned acidity earlier. But I think it's important maybe to point out that this isn't acidity in the way that I don't know, a Sauvignon Blanc, a white wine might have acidity. This is just sort of it's an underlying aliveness in the wine, but you don't taste lemon, you don't taste acidity in the way you do when you drink white wine that is high in acidity.
Acidity gets used a lot to describe balance. Um, but as you say, and particularly in fortified wines and aged fortified wines, the character of acidity changes as you age. And um, and so what happens, although ports start with a low natural acidity, as for example, if you're making a white wine, you want to choose vineyards, and that's why a lot of the great white wines come from the cooler climate regions where you have a high natural acidity. Um, with the tawny ports, because as you age, you evaporate basically your water and your alcohol, you concentrate those natural acids. So analytically, your total acidity increases with your tawny ports as they age. Then you have the other factor which increases, which is your volatile acidity. And your volatile acidity also increases as you age. And that is also part of the balance of a tawny port as it ages. And then you have this other aspect, which is the sweetness. Now, sugar is a great tool to fool cutting corners. So if you want to give a sensation of age and you launch it very sweet, then it will seem old. So if you want to do something like what we do with the Taylor Fladgate 30-year-old and have it drier, then you've got to make sure that you age it really well. And by this 30-year-old having a lower sweetness than is usual, then the acidity shows even better. And so I'm glad you enjoy this, because that's why this is also so special to me.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's very beautiful. And I think that dryness, you had mentioned earlier when we began that even when a port, of course, seems sweet initially, it should finish with this dry, beautiful, sort of hauntingly bone dry, clean, dramatic dryness at the finish. That's really important, and makes the wine, to me, even more interesting. It's a very interesting dichotomy to start sweet and then dry. Very cool.
But as consumers, what happens is that if we're drinking a sticky, it can be interesting to taste, but then we don't drink it. And ultimately, in the wine world, we're making them to be drunk and enjoyed. And so yes. So one thing is tasting, and that's why, you know, and for us as professionals, evaluating wine in a lineup, with tasting them on their own, or then drinking with food, it is different sensations. And so, but very much finding this balance is so important, because it is not just the complexity of aromas, that initial impact. And that's why for me, in the port, making sure that they're not stickies, they do taste sweet and finish dry, is so important for the drinkability of them.
Yeah. All right. Should we go to this
Yes.
incredible 40-year-old, which I rarely get a chance to taste 40-year-olds. So, and here's this beautiful bottle with 40 right there in the label. Gorgeous, very individual bottles, by the way. You can always tell a Taylor Fladgate bottle. So this is, there's not a lot of 40-year-old around, not that I see. I mean, most stores stock 10, 20, and 30.
Well, Um, it depends on your store, but again, not all port shippers produce a 40-year-old, and so not all port shippers have got these stocks to be able to bring a 40-year-old to the market. And for us, it has always been one of our important ports in our lineup. And what you get with a 40 is you get this incredible concentration. And so to make one bottle of 40-year-old, I have to set aside at the harvest two bottles equivalent, because we lose over 40 years, we lose exactly the equivalent of what we bottle. So that's your cumulative evaporation. And inevitably that gives you that concentration, that intensity of flavors which the 40-year-old gets. So I'd say the 40-year-old is the most interesting. For you, Karen, it's probably the most difficult to describe, because it has so many different things going on. But that's the beauty of it. So in fact, that probably brings us on to another point, which is the glass that we use to drink port.
Yeah, so I wanted to see, let me see your glass. Let me see
No,
your glass.
don't, because I'm using a tasting room glass.
Here's my glass.
Well,
No?
I'm doing this, we're doing this conversation in my, alongside my tasting room. And in the tasting room, we use this very small, very funneled glass, because what this does is it concentrates all of the aromas, good and bad. But as professionals, we need to really understand every characteristic of it. But when you're drinking it, use a normal wine glass. Port is not port, it's port wine. All of us, half of the pleasure that we get in wine is enjoying the aromas, all of the smell, before we even put it in the mouth. So why would you drink port in a small glass? That's sacrilege. You're losing out. So use a wine glass.
Totally. Yeah.
That's half of the pleasure of drinking wine. Otherwise, why not just put it in a jug and knock it back? That's not the way we drink our wine. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And so I'm using the basic tasting glass of Riedel here. I actually considered using a larger glass, but you know, David, I want to, I don't know if you're seeing the questions rolling in as I am, but I think it's
actually, so
so let me ask this one question that Charles is asking coming in, because I think it's important. You had mentioned in the 30-year-old that, or rather, when we were tasting the 30-year-old, you had mentioned that acidity is being concentrated and also volatile acidity is being concentrated. Would you like to define for everyone volatile acidity?
Volatile acidity is increasing. So as part of volatile acidity is in a young wine which has been made with not a lot of attention, is considered a fault. And but your volatile acidity is part of the natural aging process of any wine. So the more you age any wine, that volatile acidity increases naturally. And that is part of your transformation of your sugars, of your acids, and it's also one of your components, because there are many different acids in wine, and so that is what your volatile acidity is.
If you, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. I will tell you how I explain it to students, and I hope I haven't been doing this wrong for years and years now. But from a flavor perspective, what I often say about volatile acidity is that, in a sense, this is the non-scientific way of describing it, it's a bit of a precursor to something like balsamic vinegar. So a little touch of it is that je ne sais quoi in the back of a wine. It's really, it adds an interesting note. You see it in a lot of Northern Italian wines, for example. You could see it in Amarone all the time. You see it in a lot of California Cabernets. And it's only terrible if it is absolutely dominating, especially an unfortified wine dominated by volatile acidity. That would be, you know, even in my office, we would be writing, as you see, I'm writing all these notes. We'd be writing no, no, no. But a little bit of that touch in the way background of something like balsamic vinegar is really cool.
And that's very well described. Every single wine that you drink in the world has got volatile acidity. It's one of the components. Now, either have your natural volatile acidity or your volatile acidity from spoilage. If it is natural, then it is part of it. If you're reckless, it will come from spoilage. And so maybe we're getting too technical.
Yeah. Well, let's focus on the flavors of
40.
this 40-year-old, because one of the things that you could imagine, I suppose, is if you took a, I don't know, you know, a big pot of bones and reduce them down and reduce them down and reduce them down, you'd be reducing flavors, but you'd be concentrating absolutely everything, as you've pointed out. So when I taste this 40-year-old, for the very first time, I almost even get a sense of something, it's dry, something almost like saline, a beautiful sense of saltiness in this wine too, just by virtue of its being so reduced down. And of course, there's not actual salt. I don't mean actual salt, but just maybe, I don't know if I could say minerality. It's hard to describe this idea, except that you've reduced it extraordinarily.
I think you just actually, you've given a new term for our photo port, which is, this is a port reduction. So, and in essence, when I started saying that to bottle one bottle, we start with two, that's what we have done. This is a reduction and a concentration. Very interesting point that you said, the saltiness. And that's actually really, really interesting because, again, although the 40-year-old is much sweeter than the 30, that saltiness on the finish is very much an indication that we've managed to have that dryness on the finish, and which is so important. What's also interesting is that when your tawny ports start aging, when they're young, they've got more color. They lose the color as they become tawny, they lose their red. But as they get older, they increase in color because you go from brick to olive. And you've got the rim of the 40-year-old has got this olive rim. You have got the color, the depth of brownness is much deeper. So in terms of a palette of colors, the tawny ports go from dark when they're young, they become lighter, and then they become darker again. And in fact, we have in our visitor center here in Gaia, we have an artist who does paintings with different ports, because different ports have got so many different color tones. It makes a real palette of different colors. But then the concentration of this is extraordinary. So, and again, and I think also one of the experiences that you get when you're drinking a tawny port is the length on the finish. And when you're enjoying any of these old tawnies, there are several ways of enjoying them. One which is most usually talked about is with your dessert. Any egg-based dessert, anything with nuts, that's a natural. But the tawny ports are a dessert in their own right. So if you finish a meal and you don't feel like going for dessert, but you don't really want to get up from the table with your savoury, why not serve a glass of a tawny port as the dessert? And that is delicious.
Yep.
The other way that I think tawny ports are incredible is that a beautifully chilled tawny port sitting out on the veranda on a warm summer evening is the best lubricant of the conversation in the world. And you can just sit out and chat and have a sip. And port, you can get that enjoyment out of it tremendously. And I know certainly during this chat, I've been lubricating my voice plenty of time with grabbing a glass. And the tawny ports are the best for that. Great lubricant of the conversation.
Well, now that we're all staying home too, at least we are in the States a bit. But David, before I let you go, let me ask this one question from Domenico coming in, because this is such a good question, which is there any way to know when a tawny port has been bottled? And I guess the question really is, do you need to know? Because you have made once this wine is in the bottle, it's probably not going to age very much beyond that because of the fortification, right?
Well,
I mean, unless you left it for a really long time.
Well, what I would say is, and to answer Domenico, which is a very good question, on the label of every tawny port, you'll have a bottling date. And so this is the Tailfaglia 10-year-old on the back label, got bottled in 2020. And so you'll have that guide. It's part of the norms of the port wine industry. And so all port shippers will have to do that. But the key point that Karen is making, and importantly, is that with the tawny ports, these are ports which have been aged in contact with oxygen. We have aged them and blended them, and we bottle them when we feel they're right for drinking. And in the bottle, they're not going to gain from further development of the bottle. If anything, they will start losing some of that crispness that we have. And so we don't recommend that you age a tawny port in the bottle. Having said that, these ports are, by nature, if you take a 20-year-old, which has been in wood for 20 years, well then that's why we use the stopper corks, because once you open your bottle, it will stay fresh for 4 or 5 weeks. It'll stay exactly the same. If you forget about it in your cellar for 3 or 4 years, it will still be absolutely delicious. But why do that? Because you can go out to your local wine store and you can get another one. And we at home are doing our work to make it consistently the same. So the ports that we do recommend you put in your cellar to age are your vintage ports, where the vintage port we will bottle 2 years after the harvest, and then there the aging will be done in the bottle. And if you enjoy the characteristic of an old vintage port, but then we do recommend that you buy them young and put them in your cellar. So do you think that covers the question, Karen?
I think that covers it. David, thank you so much for allowing me to taste these wines with you. It was really just so eye-opening to see them all at a given all together at one moment in time. So much fun. And even it's perhaps a lot to ask consumers to do, but even if you just took 2 wines, a 10-year-old and a 30-year-old, and sat down with a bottle of each and got some friends together over Zoom or something, it would be a really fun tasting to do. And thanks for reminding us to drink some of these this summer. Chilled. We'll remember that.
It will make the summer even more enjoyable. It will make a conversation even more interesting, and it will make us overlook some of the moments we're going through. Karen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to join us. I know I have enjoyed this tremendously, and I look forward to when you come back to our wonderful Douro Valley and have a good taste of our ports together. And thank you everybody for joining us.
You'll see.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers back, David. Thank you.
Take care.